Hello, come in. Oh, hi, nice to see you again. Come over here. I was putting different books on the book rest here. You'll see that here I've got, this is one of my several copies of Thomas Malory's Mort Data. After Tennyson had taken up the Arthur stories, often using Malory as a source, it popularised Malory, and there were lots of late Victorian and Edwardian editions. I mean, look at this. 1929, or says, you know, the page edges creased. £10. Well, it's nothing. And it's very beautifully illustrated, and it's the Medici Society of London. But I'm using this one at the moment because it's unabridged. It's the full text, and it's the original 15th century text. Malory, of course, wasn't the originator. I mean, isn't, you know, the stories of Arthur have many different roots and sources. There's no official version of the story of Arthur. Arthur, you know, the once and future king, is both a figure of the past and in some respects a figure of the present and, you know, and of the future. But what Malory did was to take a lot of other sources, including what he calls the French book. I mean, probably Chrétien de Troyes. The French and the Italians and the Germans were as much in love with Arthur as we are, and his story went right across Europe. I mean, of course, he's Arthur of the Britons, and the Britons in that sense were this Celtic speaking people. So the original Arthur, if we can engage in speculations about a historical Arthur, was probably well, he was a Celt. Some people think he was as they say, a Romano-British king, somebody flourishing after the Romans left and before the Anglo-Saxons invaded, and trying to unite the Celtic peoples of these islands in a kingdom which was at once a fulfilment of a lot of the pagan motifs, but also deeply Christian. All the great feasts of Pentecost and so on are marked in the annals of the telling of the story. Anyway, it is our national story. It is, in fact, they used to call it, you know, what Homer wrote about in the Trojan Wars, and of course after him Virgil was known as the Matter of Troy, and stories about Charlemagne was the Matter of Gaul or the Matter of France, and stories about Arthur and Merlin and the Grail were all stories called the Matter of Britain. And I have an interest in it. In fact, if you come over here, I'll show you. Central on this table, piled with other things, between these two book rests, one of which is over at this end, is Don Quixote, and the other is Sancho Panza. Of course, Spanish figures who also have a love of the Arthur and the knight stories. Resting between them is my collection of material about this. I would have gradually acquired it anyway, but I have a desire, I suppose as every English poet does, eventually to make poetry myself out of some of this, and indeed I've started to do so. I'll just put that. So let me just show you quickly what's here. I think I've probably already shown you that I've got the big poetic versions of it, again in these lovely illustrated versions. That's this is Tennyson's Idylls of the King, very beautifully printed out, and with these wonderful, look, there's Merlin beneath the oak, having been enchanted by Vivian, as Tennyson chooses to call her, although she has many other names. This is an amazing. Of course, within the Arthurian stuff, there's the great epic stories of the battles, and there's the deep, numinous Christian story of the Grail. But of course, there are all these romances within it. So this is just drawing out the Tristan and Isolde parts of the story. I think this is a particularly beautiful book. You can see this late Victorian and early Edwardian desire to reproduce the beauties of medieval books using modern printed techniques. That's a glorious version. And then there's also, of course, the scholarly work about Arthur, the trying to find the historical Arthur. Here's a book, John Morris's The Age of Arthur. Here, this is And of course, every age people take it up. This is an interesting book. This is called The Inklings, King Arthur, The Inklings and King Arthur. J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield, and The Matter of Britain. This is the only thing so far that I've actually, where I've published something about Arthur, and this is an academic thing. I wrote the concluding chapter in this book, summing up what the Inklings had done with Arthur and what might still be done with it. So I was very pleased to contribute to that book. And then, as well as Malory, there are the other historical sources. So one of the early his sources, Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. This is a nice Folio Society edition of that book. Of course, it's originally in Latin and then it was translated. And again, I got this for very little, £6.50. A beautiful box books, and this is really nice because it has lots of the medieval illustrations. Because when the Normans came in, and particularly when they came to Wales, because the Normans had defeated the Anglo-Saxons in order to take England, and because the great stories of Arthur were about a king who also fought the Anglo-Saxons, funny enough, the Normans thought, well, okay, he's our man, and so they took a great interest in him. So there's a wide range of stuff. There's modern versions of it. There's the Arthurian torso here, which is a book jointly by Charles Williams and C.S. Lewis. There's Charles Williams's own poetry about Arthur. There we are, Taliesin through Logres. I mean, this is just amazing, strange poetry, but very beautiful. So I've got all this stuff. Why don't you come over? There's no point in talking about these stories if I don't give you a taste of them. Oh, I'll show you one more thing before we go. This is my go-to version of Malory when I just want to read the text, because it's a beautiful, comfortable book to read. But I also have another edition of Malory, which I don't use as often because it's abridged, and I don't always trust other people's abridgments. I want to, But the advantage of this one, this is a reproduction of an early one, is that this is illustrated by none other than Arthur Rackham. So I'm going to read you a little bit about Galahad in a moment, but I'll show you the Arthur Rackham illustrations of the chapters I'm going to read, of Sir Galahad and the Quest of the Holy Grail. And there's a look at this. This is wonderful. I'll show you. This is the red and white marble floating on which the sword was. There's a parallel many parallels between Galahad and Arthur, and Galahad draws the sword from the floating stone at Camelot, part of proving who he is. So I like the illustrations of that one, but I don't completely trust it as a text, because the abridgers miss out something that they think is unimportant, but that I might think was very important indeed. Anyway, come over and have a seat. Malory's text was written in the late 15th century, so it's late Middle English. It's a slightly different way of saying things. But that's part of what I like about it. Book 13 of Malory is the book that deals with the matter of the Grail, and therefore brings in the character of Galahad. I first heard stories of the Grail and Galahad not from any book, not from The Sword in the Stone, not from the T.H. White versions, not from a TV version, but from my mother's lips. My mother was a great reader of Malory and used to retell the Malory stories to me. And I was always attracted as a small boy to the character of Galahad. Everybody else was saying, oh, Sir Lancelot is the greatest knight, and they want to be like Sir Lancelot. But I knew I could never be like Sir Lancelot, any more than I could be captain of a school cricket team or a sports thing. I wasn't the sort of super sporty type, and for that kind of physical prowess. But I loved adventure, and I loved mystery, and I always had these kind of glimmerings of light and senses of the numinous and the presence of the holy coming into my life one way or another. And of course that's where Galahad came in, that it was Galahad who would achieve the quest of the Grail, and Galahad who in a sense had this second sight. But of course the point of the story is that although very few people know it, possibly not Galahad until later himself, maybe not even Lancelot. Galahad is Lancelot's son. By an enchantment, he mistakes Elaine, Galahad's mother, for Guinevere, and this is all part of the fulfilment of the quest of the Grail, that even through, if you like, Lancelot's sin, this beautiful achievement will come into the world, and something, in some sense, he will be redeemed by his son. So let me just read you the whole beginning of Book 13 in a little bit, something of the first and something of the second chapter, just to give you a flavour. I'll tell you now why I've turned back to it just now. I wrote that ballad of Galahad I recited to you, which was for a thing called The Lost Tales of Galahad. It wasn't meant to be about the Grail. But it went so well that I suddenly thought, maybe I should start my Arthurian things now. Maybe I should get back into it. And maybe I should write some more ballads about Galahad and actually tell the Grail story in ballad form. I don't know if it'll work out or not, but I'm priming myself. So, how at the vigil of the feast of Pentecost entered into the hall before King Arthur a damosel, and desired Sir Lancelot for to come and dub a knight, and how he went with her. So, classic opening. At the vigil of Pentecost, when all the fellowship of the Round Table were come unto Camelot, and there heard their service, and the tables were set ready to the meat, right so entered into the hall a full fair gentlewoman on horseback, that had ridden full fast, for her horse was besweated. Then she there alighted, and came before the king, and saluted him, and said, and he said, Damosel, God thee bless. Sir, said she, for God's sake, say me where Sir Lancelot is. Yonder ye may see him, said the king. Then she went unto Lancelot, and said, Sir Lancelot, I salute you on King Pelles' behalf, and I require you to come on with me there hereby into the forest. Then Sir Lancelot asked her with whom she dwelled. I dwell, said she, with King Pelles. And what will ye with me, said Lancelot. Ye shall know, said she, when ye come hither. Well, said he, I will gladly go with you. So Sir Lancelot bade his squire saddle his horse and bring him arms, and in all haste he did his commandment. It's wonderful the way these adventures start. You're just about to sit down, somebody comes in, come with me. What's it all about? You'll find out when you get there. That's what the adventure is. But of course, King Pelles is Elaine's father, and Lancelot has been in that castle before and himself had some glimmering that the Grail is there. And perhaps he knows, but doesn't quite admit, that actually there is the son, or the knowledge of the son that he had by fair Elaine. There's a bit later on, of course, Guinevere immediately objects to him going off. Maybe she's got some inkling. But they're not going to the castle, they're going into the forest. So what happens when they go into the forest? So they rode into the forest. Right so departed Sir Lancelot with the gentlewoman, and rode until they came into a forest and into a great valley, and saw an abbey of nuns, and there a squire ready, and opened the gates. And so they entered and descended off their horses. And then, of course, they come in there. And meanwhile, where they stood there talking together, therein came 12 nuns that brought with them Galahad, the which was passing fair and well made, uneath in the world that men might find his match. And all those ladies wept. Sir, said they all, we bring you here this child, the which we have nourished, and pray you to make him a knight. For a more worthier man's hand may he not receive from him the order of knighthood. Sir Lancelot beheld the young squire, and saw him seemly and demure as a dove, with all manner of good features, that he weened of his age never to have seen so fair a man of form. Then said Sir Lancelot, cometh this desire of himself? Well, of course, this is Lancelot's son. And the ladies, the nuns, are weeping because they love the child, but he has to leave the convent, and he has to go out and seek his adventures in the world. And it turns out that it's his own father who's going to make him a knight, but that's not acknowledged. And meanwhile, while this adventure is happening, we get told in chapter 2 of how the rest of them are all at the Mass for the Feast of Pentecost, and then they come back. And there's one siege, as it's called, or seat in the Round Table that nobody sits at, because it's called the Siege Perilous, and you have to be exactly the right person to sit there, and the person who sits there will achieve extraordinary things. But if the wrong person sits there, then the terrible fate will befall them. And they come back and they find the golden letters written around the siege have suddenly changed. The barons espied in the sieges of the Round Table all about, written with golden letters, here ought to sit he, and so ought to sit here. And thus they went along until they came to the Siege Perilous, where they found letters newly written of gold, which said, 400 winters and 54 accomplished after the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ ought this siege to be fulfilled. Then all they said, this is a marvellous thing and an adventurous. In the name of God, Sir Lancelot, and then in the name of God, said Sir Lancelot, and then accounted the term of writing from the birth of Lord unto the day. It seemeth to me, said Sir Lancelot, this siege ought to be fulfilled this same day, for this is the feast of Pentecost after 454 years. And so they realise something's going to happen. And of course, meantime, we know Galahad has been knighted. And then, of course, they're about to sit down to the feast when the king is reminded that he's not allowed to sit and eat at the feast until some adventure or marvel has come. And somebody comes in just at the right moment and says, Sir, there is beneath at the river a great stone which I saw fleet above the water, and I saw therein sticking a sword. The king said, I will see that marvel. So all the knights went with him, and they came unto the river, and found there a stone fleeting, as it were of red marble, and therein stuck a fair rich sword. In the pommel thereof were precious stones wrought with subtle letters of gold. Then the barons read the letters, which said in this wise, Never shall man take me hence, but only he by whose side I ought to hang, and he shall be the best knight in the world. Well, you can see the story all being set up, and eventually, of course, Galahad is going to arrive and achieve the sword and sit in the seat perilous. And when he does, something that's been waiting to happen begins to happen, and the first sight of the Holy Grail happens. It's amazing storytelling. And as I say, I want to delve deeply back into it and find my own way of telling it in our time and for our days. So watch this space, as they say. We'll see how I get on. Thanks for dropping by.